She arrived with nothing but a dead man's ledger and a plan nobody asked for. And within 48 hours, she had turned a dying Montana ranch upside down. What happened next cost her everything and saved everyone. Welcome to a story about a woman who walked into ruins and refused to see them that way. If you've ever been counted out, underestimated, or told it was already over, this one's for you. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The advertisement was 11 words long. Rancher seeking capable wife, Montana. No promises made. Inquire sincerely. Lenora Whitfield read it 3 times at the kitchen table of the boarding house in Billings, with $42 in her coat pocket and her father's ledger pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Outside, November was making itself known, wind scraping dead leaves against the window glass, sky the color of dirty dishwater. She wasn't romantic about it. She hadn't been romantic about much since the bank took the flour mill, and her father's heart gave out 2 weeks later, like he simply couldn't be bothered to witness the aftermath. She understood that impulse. There were mornings she felt it herself. But she wasn't her father. She didn't surrender. She wrote back the same evening. 3 weeks later, Lenora stepped off a wagon onto the frozen earth of the Mercer property and stood very still for a moment, taking inventory. The main house needed paint. The fence line along the eastern pasture had buckled in at least 4 places she could see from where she stood. A water trough near the barn had cracked clean through, and someone had wedged a piece of rotted timber underneath it as a temporary fix that had clearly been temporary for about 2 years. Smoke wasn't coming from the smokehouse at the far end of the property, which made sense, she supposed, given that the smokehouse roof appeared to have partially collapsed. A man came out of the barn. He was taller than she'd expected from his letters, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of face that might have been pleasant once and now mostly just looked tired. He had mud on his boots up past the ankle and a cut on his jaw that hadn't been attended to properly. He stopped about 10 feet away from her and looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he's not sure he has the energy to solve. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She didn't extend her hand. Her hands were full, travel bag in one, her father's ledger tucked under the same arm. The advertisement said capable. I want you to know I took that word seriously. He studied her face. That's good. Is it? She glanced back toward the smokehouse. Because that structure at the far end of your property, is that the smokehouse? What's left of it? When did it stop being used? Something shifted in his expression. Not annoyance exactly. More like the particular discomfort of a man being asked about a wound he'd stopped looking at. 3 years ago, maybe closer to 4. Roof caved in during a bad winter. After that, He stopped, shrugged. It didn't seem worth it. Lenora set her bag down in the dirt. I'd like to see it before anything else. The wedding is supposed to be... I know when the wedding is. She looked at him directly. I've come a long way, Mr. Mercer, and I intend to stay. But before I say any words in front of a preacher, I want to understand what I'm actually walking into. So I'd appreciate it if you'd walk me to that smokehouse. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved between them. All right, he said finally. What? She'd seen neglect before. Neglect had a particular smell, rot, dust, the specific sourness of things left too long without attention. The smokehouse had all of that. The roof on one side had come down, and the collapse had pulled part of the eastern wall with it, leaving a gap about the width of a man's shoulders. Someone had nailed boards across it in a half-hearted attempt at weatherproofing that hadn't worked. Inside, old smoke rings still darkened the interior walls. The hanging iron hooks were still in place, most of them solid. The fire pit was buried under debris, but the structure of it was intact. Lenora walked the perimeter twice without speaking. She pressed her palm against the standing walls and felt the mortar give slightly but hold. She crouched and examined the foundation stones. She looked up at the surviving roof section and calculated the angle of the damage. Callan Mercer stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression that wasn't quite skepticism and wasn't quite hope, and couldn't quite figure out which way to fall. It's fixable, she said. The mason I brought out here 2 years ago said it would cost more than... The mason was probably looking at it as a demolition job. She straightened up, brushing dirt from her skirt. Which it isn't. The foundation is sound. The walls that are standing are solid. The collapse is contained to one corner and the roof over it. You rebuild that section, remortar the cracks, replace the damaged ironwork, rehang the racks. She paused. I'd estimate 3 weeks of focused labor. Maybe 4 if the weather turns. Callan stared at her. You've done this before. My father ran a small meatpacking operation for 11 years. I grew up watching him cure everything from beef to venison to bear. I know what I'm looking at. She turned to face him. Do you have men who can work? I have 22 men who haven't had a full paycheck in 6 weeks. The number hit her, but she didn't let it show. 22 men. That was 22 families or 22 futures or 22 reasons the situation was more urgent than she'd prepared for. Are they still here? She asked. Most of them. A few left last month. The rest... He exhaled. I guess they don't have anywhere better to go. Or they're loyal, she said quietly. Don't underestimate that. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in the way he did it. Not like he was sizing her up the way men usually sized her up, but more like he was trying to figure out if she was actually going to be something or if he was just desperate enough to believe she would be. The preacher's coming at 4, he said. Then we better walk back. The ceremony was brief. The preacher was a thin man named Aldous who smelled faintly of whiskey and had the practiced speed of someone who had married many reluctant people in his career. There were no flowers. 2 of the ranch hands stood as witnesses, a barrel-chested man named Walt with a white scar through one eyebrow, and a young Mexican wrangler named Tomas, who kept fidgeting with the brim of his hat. Callan said his words without stumbling over them, which Lenora respected. She said hers clearly. When it was done, Aldous shook their hands, pocketed his fee, and was back on his wagon inside of 10 minutes. Walt let out a long breath. Well, he said, welcome to the Mercer Ranch, Mrs. Mercer. The name landed strangely. She let it. Thank you, Walt. She looked around at the assembled group. A dozen ranch hands had drifted over to watch from a respectful distance. Their faces a careful mix of curiosity and reservation. They looked gaunt. Several of them had the hollowed-out look she associated with men who were rationing their meals and pretending not to be. I'd like to address everyone before supper, if that's all right. Callan looked slightly startled. You want to... Just a few minutes. She raised her voice enough to carry. Could everyone gather, please? They gathered. It took a moment. Some of them reluctant, some just surprised. But they came, shuffling into a loose semicircle in front of the barn. She counted them. 17. The other 5, she would learn later, were out on the range. She stood in front of them without any performance, just stood there and let them look at her, and she looked back. I know I'm new, she said. I know you don't have any reason to trust what I say yet. That's fair. I wouldn't either. She paused. I also know things have been hard here. I'm not going to pretend I arrived with solutions to every problem, because I haven't. What I can tell you is that I've spent the last 3 years watching a business collapse from the inside, and I've spent those same 3 years learning everything about why it happened and what I would have done differently. She let that settle. The smokehouse at the south end of the property isn't ruined. It's been forgotten. I intend to unforget it. And if every man here is willing to put in the work, I believe we can make something of this place that isn't just survival. Silence. The wind moved through. An older hand near the back. 60s, gray-bearded, with the weathered permanence of a man who had simply decided to stay wherever he was, said, without particular hostility, with respect, ma'am, people have said things like that before. I know. She met his eyes. What's your name? Silas? Silas. You're right to be skeptical. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to show up tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock and watch what happens. She let the corner of her mouth move, just slightly. That's all. They ate supper that evening in the main house. Callan, Lenora, Walt, and Tomas, who had apparently become something of a fixture at the house table. The meal was salt pork and beans with hardtack that had seen better weeks. Lenora ate without complaint. The smokehouse, she said when there was a pause in the conversation. Where are we on materials? Do you have usable brick stockpiled anywhere, or would we need to source it? Callan looked at her across the table. There's a partial load left over from when they built the second barn, probably 60, 70 bricks. We'd need more. What about the iron racks? The old ones are still in there, bent, but the blacksmith in town, Havelock. Walt said the name like it tasted slightly sour. Is he reliable? He's reliable if you pay him, Walt said, or if he likes you. He didn't particularly like Mr. Mercer after the... He stopped, glancing sideways at Callan. After the payment I missed, Callan said flatly. No embarrassment in his voice, just the particular exhaustion of a man who had said the same sentence several times and gotten tired of softening it. Last spring, I was 2 weeks late. He's held it against me since. Lenora looked at her husband. Would he hold it against me? He doesn't know you. That's what I'm counting on. She turned back to her plate. I'll go into town day after tomorrow. I want to look at the accounts first. Callan set down his fork. Lenora. She looked up. The accounts are... He stopped, started again. They're not good. I want you to know that before you see them. I don't want... Another stop. He was, she realized, a man who had some difficulty completing sentences when they required him to be vulnerable. I wasn't sure how to say that in a letter. You don't have to be sorry about it, she said. I didn't come here expecting prosperity. She held his gaze. I came here because I'm good at seeing what things can be when nobody else can anymore. That's all. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. Walt was looking at his beans. Tomas had developed a sudden intense interest in his hardtack. All right, Callan said finally. I'll get you the books after supper. She sat with the ledgers until past midnight, at the small desk in the corner of the room that was now hers, sparse, with a narrow bed and a single window that faced east. She'd lit 2 candles and positioned them carefully. The numbers were, as Callan had warned, not good. They were, in fact, arresting. Debts to the bank, debts to the feed supplier, debts to 2 neighboring ranches for emergency supplies. A note due in, she counted carefully, 4 months. If they missed it, the bank held the right to begin foreclosure proceedings within 30 days. 4 months and 30 days. She wrote the number at the top of a fresh page and underlined it twice. She was still working through the 3rd ledger when she found the clause. It wasn't in the main loan documents. It was buried in the addendum to a contract signed 3 years earlier. A debt restructuring agreement, small print, dense legal language that looked like it had been written specifically to be overlooked. She read it twice to make sure she understood it correctly. In the event of default, secondary creditor Gideon Thorne holds right of first acquisition at current assessed value, exercisable within 15 days of foreclosure notice. She sat back in her chair. Gideon Thorne. She didn't know the name. She wrote it down and looked at it. Someone had structured this contract very carefully. The main bank loan looked like a normal debt. But if the ranch defaulted, a private party, Thorne, had the legal right to swoop in and buy the property before anyone else could bid on it, at a price that would be set during a foreclosure when the property's assessed value was at its lowest. It was elegant in the way a trap was elegant. You couldn't see it until you were already in it. She closed the ledger and sat in the candlelight for a long time. Outside, the Montana wind had picked up. She could hear it pressing against the window glass, testing the seal. The cattle in the distant pasture were moving restlessly, probably feeling the drop in temperature. She thought about her father. She thought about the mill. She thought about what it looked like when something failed, not because of bad luck or bad crops or bad weather, but because someone had arranged it to fail. She thought about the smokehouse. She picked up her pen. At the top of a new page, she wrote 2 headings. What we have, what we need. She began to write. At 6 in the morning, she was already at the smokehouse. The temperature had dropped overnight, and her breath fogged in front of her. She'd dressed practically. Heavy coat, work gloves, boots that had seen better years but still had their structure. She had a lantern, a measuring rope, and a notebook. She was sketching the interior dimensions when Walt arrived. He stopped in the doorway, surprised. You're already here. Couldn't sleep. She didn't look up from her sketch. Come in and tell me which of the men have done any kind of masonry work, even minor work, even if it was years ago. Walt stepped inside, ducking under a sagging ceiling beam. Silas laid stone for 2 years before he came here. And there's a man named Percival, goes by Percy. He did some brickwork out of Bozeman. Good. I want them on the wall repair starting today. The others can clear debris from the interior and sort what's salvageable. She turned the notebook toward him, showing him the sketch with her repair priorities marked in order. I want the eastern wall stabilized before we touch the roof. If we start with the roof and that wall shifts, we lose everything. Walt studied the sketch. He was quiet for a moment. You drew this from memory? You only walked through here once. Twice, she said. And I have a good memory. She took the notebook back. The brick pile from the second barn. Can we get it moved down here this morning? I can get 3 men on it. 4 would be faster. 4 it is. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was carefully neutral, but had something underneath it. Something reassessing. You have questions, she said. A few. Ask them. I'd rather know what people are thinking than have them think it quietly where I can't address it. Walt was quiet for a moment. Then, what happens if this doesn't work? It was a fair question. She gave it the answer it deserved. Then, we're in the same position we're in right now, but we tried something. That's better than not trying. The men are scared, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact he was handing her. I know. She turned back to her sketch. Fear's not the problem, Walt. People can work scared. The problem is when they stop believing the work matters. She made a notation in the margin. That's what I'm trying to change. He was quiet for another moment. Then he nodded once. A slow, deliberate nod that meant something, she thought. That meant he'd made a decision. I'll get the men, he said, and stepped back out into the morning. Lenore stayed where she was for a moment, looking up at the surviving section of roof, at the iron hook still hanging patient and dark in the cold air, waiting. She opened her notebook to the page with the 2 headings. What we have, what we need. The first list was short, the second was long. But she had done this before, stood at the beginning of something impossible, and talked herself into believing it was merely difficult. She began adding items. She did not think about Gideon Thorne yet. There would be time for that. First, she had a smokehouse to save. The first week was ugly in the way that necessary things often are. Lenore had drawn up a work schedule the morning after the wedding and pinned it to the barn door before anyone came to breakfast. It assigned men to specific tasks, set start times, set break times, and left no room for ambiguity. She'd learned from watching her father's mill fall apart that ambiguity was where discipline went to die. When nobody was sure who was responsible for something, the answer was usually nobody. The men read the schedule in silence. A few of them exchanged glances she didn't try to interpret. Silas stood in front of it for a long moment with his arms folded, then turned and found her watching from across the yard. He didn't say anything. He just unfolded his arms and walked toward the smokehouse. That was enough. By mid-morning, the debris inside the smokehouse had been cleared and sorted into 2 piles. Salvageable material on the left, waste on the right. The waste pile was larger. Percy, the man from Bozeman, had assessed the damaged wall and given Lenora an honest account that included the phrase worse than it looks from outside, which she had expected, and but not unfixable, which she had also expected. Silas had already begun remortaring the cracked section of the west wall, working steadily and without comment, the way a man works when he actually knows what he's doing. Callan found her mid-afternoon standing outside the smokehouse with her notebook, watching the work. You didn't sleep much last night, he said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. I had reading to do. He stood beside her for a moment. He smelled like horses and cold air. The ledgers? Among other things. She kept her eyes on the wall where Silas was working. Callan, who is Gideon Thorne? The silence that followed was about 3 seconds long. It told her more than his answer did. Where did you see that name? His voice had changed, not dramatically. He wasn't a man given to dramatics, but something in it had tightened. It's in the addendum to your debt restructuring agreement from 3 years ago. She turned to look at him. He holds right of first acquisition if the bank forecloses, at assessed value, which during a foreclosure would be significantly below what this property is actually worth. Callan was looking at the ground. His jaw had set. I knew about the clause, he said. All right. When I signed it, I didn't think I needed the restructuring, and Thorne's man presented it as standard language. Said every agreement in the county had something similar. He paused. I found out later that wasn't true. How much later? About 6 months after I signed. He finally looked at her. By then it didn't seem to matter because I was more worried about making the next payment than about what happened if I couldn't. Lenora nodded slowly. She understood that logic. When you were drowning, you didn't spend much time thinking about what happened to your house after you were gone. What do you know about him? Thorne? Callan was quiet for a moment, like he was choosing what to say carefully. He runs a land speculation operation out of Helena, buys distressed properties, has about a dozen ranches under some form of contract across 3 counties. He paused. There's a rumor that a few of those ranches didn't become distressed on their own, that they had help getting there. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a horse made a low, unhappy sound. But it's a rumor, Lenore said. It's a rumor, I believe, Callan said. For whatever that's worth. She looked back at the smokehouse. Silas was showing Percy something about the mortar consistency, gesturing with his trowel. It's worth something, she said. We just need it to be more than a rumor before it's useful. She made a note. Don't mention Thorne's name in front of the men yet. I don't want panic on top of everything else. You're going to handle this, Callan said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm going to try. She closed the notebook. That's all I can promise right now. He nodded, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He reached out and briefly touched her arm, just above the elbow. Not a calculated gesture, just a man touching a person he was beginning to feel something toward, uncertain how to express it. His hand was there for only a moment, and then it wasn't. All right, he said, and walked back toward the barn. Lenora stood where she was for a moment. Then she went back to work. The day she rode into town was the 5th day. She went alone, over Callan's mild objection and Walt's less mild one. She understood their concern and set it aside. A woman riding in with a husband or a large man beside her sent a particular message. She wanted to send a different one. Havelock's smithy was at the eastern end of Garnet Creek's main street, next to a feed store, and across from a building that appeared to be simultaneously a barber shop and a notary office, which struck her as an interesting combination. The smithy smelled of coal smoke and hot iron and the specific animal smell of a man who worked hard in close quarters. Havelock himself was maybe 50, with forearms like fence posts and a gray-streaked beard that needed attention. He looked at her from across his anvil with the flat assessment of a man who wasn't easily impressed and didn't particularly care if you knew it. Mrs. Mercer, he said. The name came out slightly sideways, like he was tasting it and wasn't sure about the flavor. Mr. Havelock. She didn't waste time. I need 5 hanging iron racks reformed from bent stock I'll be bringing in, and 3 new fire grates built to a specification I have written here. She put the paper on the cleanest surface she could find near him. I also need 2 dozen iron hook rings, 7-inch diameter, and I need to know your timeline. He picked up the paper, read it, set it down. Mercer owes me $42. He does, she said, and you'll receive that $42 plus payment for this new order simultaneously on the day I collect the finished pieces. I'll pay half the new order in advance today as a deposit to secure your timeline. She put the money on the paper. That's good faith, Mr. Havelock. I'm asking for the same in return. He looked at the money. He looked at her. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted into a slightly different gear. 6 days, he said. I need 4. 5. 4.5, she said, meaning I'll be here Thursday afternoon. The corner of his beard moved in a way that might have been the beginning of a smile. Fine, he said. Thursday afternoon. She was back on the road within 20 minutes. On the way out of town, she stopped at the general store and spent 40 minutes going through their supply inventory with a quiet intensity that made the store owner, a nervous man named Garrett, keep apologizing for things she hadn't complained about. She bought salt, a significant quantity of salt. She bought hardwood chips, cherry and hickory, and arranged for a larger order to be delivered out to the ranch at the end of the week. She bought cheesecloth and iron wire and 3 large ceramic crocks with lids. Garrett watched her load the wagon with the expression of a man who wasn't sure if he was witnessing something impressive or something alarming. "You're the new Mrs. Mercer?" he asked when she was paying. "I am. Word is you're fixing up the old smokehouse." Word travels fast. He shrugged in the way small-town people shrug, the particular shrug that means, of course it does, it always does. What did you expect? Is it true? The Mercer Smokehouse? It will be. She pocketed her change. We'll be looking for buyers for cured meat in about 3 weeks. If you know anyone who might be interested, I'd appreciate you mentioning it. She left him with his mouth slightly open and drove back to the ranch. The second week was better than the first, which was the most she'd hoped for. The eastern wall of the smokehouse was stabilized by Tuesday. The collapsed roof section was framed out by Wednesday evening, which was a day ahead of the schedule Lenora had drawn up. Due almost entirely to a ranch hand named Daniel, who turned out to have done 2 years of carpentry work and had been, as far as anyone could tell, simply doing fence repair and cattle work for the last 18 months because nobody had asked him about the carpentry. That bothered her more than she let on. She sat with Callan that evening on the porch, the first time they'd sat anywhere together without her having a notebook or him having something that needed doing. And she brought it up. "Daniel," she said. "Good worker," Callan said. "He's a skilled carpenter who's been fixing fence posts." She looked at the dark outline of the mountains. "How many other men here have skills nobody's asked about?" Callan was quiet for a moment. "I don't know." That's the answer I expected. She wasn't saying it as a criticism exactly, though it was adjacent to one. "I'm going to talk to each of them, individually, find out what they know how to do." She paused. "If you don't object." "Why would I object?" "Because some husbands might find it unusual, their wives conducting—" "You saved this ranch from a decision that was going to be made in about 45 days, Callan said. His voice was flat but not unkind. "I think you've earned the right to talk to whoever you want." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. There was something in his profile in the dark that she found herself noticing. The particular quality of tiredness in a man who was getting less tired, slowly, against his own expectation. Like a man who had started to believe something again and wasn't sure what to do with the feeling. "The first smoke is Friday," she said. "Is it ready?" "The oven will be ready. The first batch will be small. More of a test than anything." She paused. "But it'll smell like something." He turned to look at her. "Why does that matter?" "Because," she said carefully, "men who haven't had reason to hope in a while need something they can smell and hear and touch before they'll believe it. Numbers in a ledger don't do that. The smell of curing meat from a restored smokehouse does." She looked back at the dark. "I've seen it work before." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father's mill." "Yes." "What happened to it?" She'd known the question was coming eventually. She'd been turning over how much to say since she arrived. "Bad debt," she said. "Some of it our own mistakes, some of it not." She left it there. He seemed to understand that was as much as she was offering. "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you." She stood up. "Get some sleep, Callan. Tomorrow's going to be long." He made a sound that was approximately a laugh. Short, slightly surprised, like he'd forgotten he could. "Yes, ma'am," he said, which struck her as an interesting thing for a man to say to his wife of 8 days, and not an unwelcome one. The first smoke on Friday morning was not beautiful. To be honest about it, the first batch came out oversalted on one side and underseasoned on the other. The temperature in the firebox ran too hot for the first 2 hours because the new mortar in the rebuilt section conducted heat differently than the old, and one of the hanging racks gave way mid-afternoon and deposited 3 strips of beef into the ash below, which was a small disaster that Lenora absorbed with visible calm and internal profanity. But the smoke rose. It rose thick and fragrant above the ranch, carrying the smell of hickory and curing meat across the cold air. And by mid-morning, every ranch hand on the property had found some reason to be within sight of the smokehouse. Silas was the one who said it out loud. He'd come to stand near Lenora while she was adjusting the airflow vent, and he looked up at the smoke for a long moment. "That's the first time I've seen that smokehouse working in 4 years," he said. "Maybe longer." "How long have you been here?" she asked. 7 years? "And the smokehouse was working when you arrived?" "It was working when I arrived. I used to be able to smell it from the east pasture." He paused. "Used to make the work feel like it meant something." She looked at him. He was still watching the smoke, not her, which made it easier for him to say true things. "It will again," she said. He didn't respond to that. He went back to his work. But she noticed later in the day that he moved differently. That several of them did. Something in the shoulders, something in the pace of the work that was fractionally less like trudging and fractionally more like purpose. It wasn't transformation, it was a degree. But degrees added up. By the end of the first successful smoke, imperfect as it was, Lenora had already adjusted the process for the next attempt. New temperature markers chalked onto the firebox, a modified salt ratio, better rack spacing. She sat at the desk that night with her father's ledger open beside her notebook, cross-referencing his notes on curing time against her own observations, talking to him in the way you talk to someone who is gone, not out loud, not even quite in words, just in the quality of attention you bring to the things they taught you. She found his note on temperature regulation on page 47, in his cramped handwriting, and she felt the particular sharp grief of that. Not the overwhelming kind, but the quiet kind that lives with you, the kind that shows up when you least expect and just sits there for a moment before moving on. She copied his note into her own notebook and closed the ledger. It was during the third week that the first thing went wrong. Not wrong in the way of normal operational difficulty, a broken rack or an oversalted batch. Wrong in the way that made the back of her neck go still and cold when she finally understood what she was looking at. She'd been tracking supply inventory carefully since the beginning, logging every item in and every item used the way her father had taught her. It was a habit she'd maintained without thinking much about it. On the Tuesday of the third week, she sat down to reconcile her logs against the actual inventory in the cold storage room and found a gap she couldn't account for. 30 pounds of salt, gone. Not used, not transferred, not recorded anywhere, just absent. She checked the logs 3 times. Then she went to the cold storage herself and counted the remaining stock. The gap was real. She sat with that information for 2 hours before she did anything with it. 30 pounds of salt wasn't catastrophic. It was, in the scheme of things, a manageable loss. But 30 pounds of salt didn't vanish on its own, and the inventory records were kept in a place that required you to know where to look and how to read what you found. She went to find Walt. "I need to know," she said, when she'd explained it, "who has access to the cold storage." Walt's face had gone very careful. "Everyone, technically. The lock's been broken for about a year." "Is anyone supposed to be logging what they take out?" "They're supposed to ask me or Mr. Mercer." He paused. "Most of them do." "And this week?" He thought about it. She could see him thinking, not performing thinking, actually going back through the week in his memory, checking. "Nobody came to me about the salt," he said finally. "All right." She kept her voice level. "I want the lock on that door fixed today, and I want a new log system starting tomorrow. Every item that leaves cold storage gets signed for by name with a reason." She paused. "Don't make a production of it. Just tell the men it's a new inventory system, which it is." Walt looked at her steadily. "You think someone took it deliberately. I think 30 pounds of salt disappeared without a record. I'm not ready to call it more than that yet." But I'm watching," she said. "The salt was only this first thing. The second thing happened 4 days later, when 2 of the cattle in the near pasture developed symptoms that the ranch's part-time veterinarian, a young man named Collins, who came out from town twice a month, identified as early-stage bovine respiratory disease. By itself, it wasn't unusual. Cattle got sick, especially in cold weather. But Collins noted with some hesitation that the particular presentation was inconsistent with natural exposure and more consistent with stress-related immunosuppression caused by, as he put it delicately, a disruption to normal feeding and watering routine. Someone had been interfering with the cattle's feed. Lenora stood in the cold pasture and listened to Collins explain this and looked at the 2 sick animals and felt something settle into place in her chest, a cold, focused weight. Not panic, something more like calculation. "Can they recover?" she asked. "Probably. If we isolate them and treat them and catch the others early if more develop, then we do that." She looked at the healthy cattle near the fence line, watching her with the mild bovine curiosity she found oddly comforting. "Collins, I need you to keep what you've told me today between us for the moment." He looked at her. He was young, 26, maybe 27, with the kind of face that showed what he was thinking before he decided what to say. "You're not going to report it?" "I'm going to report it when I have something more than a probable conclusion." She looked at him steadily. "Can I count on your discretion?" He thought about it longer than she would have liked. Then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." After he left, she stood in the pasture alone for a while. The mountains were gray with coming weather. She could smell snow in the air, not yet falling, but present in that atmospheric way that Montana weather made itself known before it arrived. She thought about Gideon Thorne. She thought about the clause in the debt agreement. She thought about 30 pounds of missing salt and 2 cattle with disrupted feed, and the particular arithmetic of sabotage, small things, deniable things, things that individually meant nothing but collectively meant someone was dismantling them piece by piece. She thought about what her father had written in the front page of his ledger years ago, in the same cramped handwriting she'd spent her childhood learning to read. A patient man can walk into a burning building and walk out carrying everything worth saving. An impatient man just burns. She went back to the smokehouse. The second proper batch of cured meat came out correctly, all of it. She stood in the doorway of the smokehouse the morning they pulled it down. Walt on one side of her, Tomas on the other, both of them breathing the fragrant cold air. And she looked at the racks of properly cured beef, mahogany dark and firm and correct, and she felt something she wasn't quite expecting. Not triumph, just a deep particular satisfaction, the kind that lives below the ribs and doesn't announce itself. "That's good meat," Tomas said, with the directness of a young man who said what he saw. "That's very good meat," Walt agreed, which, from Walt, was essentially a standing ovation. Lenora reached out and pressed her thumb carefully against one of the pieces, testing the firmness. "It'll keep 6 weeks minimum in these temperatures. Longer if we pack it right." She stepped back. "Start packing the first lot today. I want it ready for the market at the end of the week." "You have a buyer?" Walt asked. "I have a conversation arranged," she said. "That's not the same thing, but it's a start." She left them to the work and walked back toward the house, her boots crunching over the frost-stiff ground, her notebook already open in her hand. Behind her, she could hear the men beginning to move, the particular sounds of a team working with some kind of momentum behind it, talking. Not the cautious silence of the first days, but actual voices, something almost like argument about the best way to pack the crates, which meant they were invested enough to have opinions. She wrote 3 things in her notebook as she walked. The first was a reminder about the cattle feed. She needed to restructure the feeding schedule and rotate the men assigned to it so that no single person had unsupervised access on a regular basis. The second was the name of a supply contractor she'd heard mentioned at the general store, a man named Aldrich Rowe, based in Billings, who handled long-term supply agreements for several of the territory's larger buyers. She'd been carrying that name around for a week. She wrote it down now and underlined it. The third thing she wrote was just 2 words, and she almost didn't write them, because writing things down made them more real, and she wasn't sure she was ready for them to be more real yet. Gideon Thorne. She stared at the name for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and went inside to start breakfast, because the men needed to eat and the work needed to continue. And there was a great deal still to build before she could afford to spend too much time thinking about who was trying to tear it down. The smoke still rose above the ranch. She could see it from the kitchen window. She put the coffee on and got to work. The man's name was Elroy Bunch, and he had a nervous habit of touching the brim of his hat when he was uncomfortable, which meant his hand went to his hat approximately every 40 seconds during the conversation Lenora had with him on the Thursday of the 4th week. She hadn't set out to find the informant. She'd set out to understand a discrepancy in the cattle feed logs, a minor arithmetic error that shouldn't have been an error at all, because the man who maintained that particular log was Percy, and Percy was meticulous to the point of occasional irritation. When she traced the discrepancy back to its source, it led her to a set of entries made on days when Percy had been reassigned to roof work on the smokehouse and someone else had covered the feed schedule. That someone was Elroy. She didn't confront him about it. That was the first decision. She sat with the information for 3 days. 3 days during which she watched Elroy Bunch with the particular attention of someone who is trying to understand rather than accuse. She watched him work. He was adequate, not exceptional. He kept mostly to himself, which wasn't unusual, but he also had a habit of being near conversations he wasn't part of. Standing within earshot at the barn, lingering at the edge of the yard during the evening when the men talked. Not obvious. Not obvious enough that she would have noticed if she hadn't been looking specifically. On the second day, she noticed he made a trip into town alone. Ranch hands occasionally did that. Garnet Creek was close enough, and the work rhythm allowed for it. But Elroy went mid-afternoon on a Wednesday, which was the busy middle of the work week, and he was gone for almost 3 hours. And when he came back, he had nothing with him. No purchases, no errand completed that she could identify. On the third day, she went to see Walt. Elroy Bunch, she said. Tell me about him. Walt was repairing a bridle and didn't look up immediately. Came on about 8 months ago, showed up looking for work. Callan hired him. He's fine, not remarkable either way. Does he have connections in town? Not that I know of. Keeps to himself mostly. Walt set down the bridle. Why? He made a trip into town Wednesday. 3 hours, nothing to show for it. Walt was quiet for a moment. His expression moved through several things and settled on something that wasn't quite worry, but was adjacent to it. You think he's the one taking the salt? I think he's the one feeding information somewhere. She kept her voice even. The salt may be connected or it may be separate. I don't know yet. She paused. I need you to act exactly as you always do around him. Nothing different. Can you do that? I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, Walt said, which was not an answer but was also entirely sufficient as one. She found Elroy on the Thursday morning, alone, moving a load of firewood from the pile near the barn to the woodshed. The work was solitary and rhythmic and provided the kind of natural cover for a private conversation that she'd been waiting for. She didn't come at it sideways. She'd learned from watching her father that sideways approaches with certain kinds of men just produced more sideways responses. She walked up, waited until he'd set down his armload, and said, Elroy, I need to talk to you about something. His hand went to his hat. Ma'am, I know you've been reporting to someone in town. I believe it's someone working for Gideon Thorne. She watched his face. The color that left it was instructive. I'm not here to fire you or turn you over to the sheriff. I want to understand your situation. He stared at her. His mouth opened and closed once. I don't know what you're... Elroy? She said his name quietly, not harshly. I've been watching for 2 weeks. I'm not guessing. I know. She paused. The question I'm actually interested in is how it started and whether you want to stop. The silence that followed was about 10 seconds long and contained a significant amount of internal activity that she could read in his face. The particular calculus of a man deciding whether to keep lying to someone who has made it clear they won't be fooled or to stop and see what the alternative looks like. His hand went to his hat again. Then he dropped it to his side. Thorne's man found me in Billings, he said, before I came here. Told me if I got hired on at Mercer and kept them informed of what was happening, I'd get paid $50 when they took the property over. He said it looking at the woodpile, not at her. I needed the money. I had debts. What kind of information have you given them? About the debt. About how bad things were. He shifted. More recently, about the smokehouse. That you were rebuilding it. The salt. He flinched. I moved it to a spot where it would look like waste. They told me to slow things down without doing anything obvious. Lenora was quiet for a moment. The cold air moved between them. She was aware of anger, not the hot kind, but the cold, precise kind that didn't cloud judgment. She let it exist and didn't let it drive. Have you told them about the supply contract I've been working toward? The conversation with Rowe and Billings? I told them you were talking to buyers. I didn't know the name. She nodded. She looked at him for a long moment, at the genuine misery in his face, which she didn't dismiss. Men who passed information for money weren't always villains. Sometimes they were just people who'd made a decision in a bad moment and were now living inside the consequences of it. That didn't make it acceptable. It just made it human. Here's what happens now, she said. You continue exactly as you have been. You report to Thorne's man in town, but what you report is what I give you. She held his gaze. You tell them the smokehouse rebuild had complications, significant complications, that the first batch has failed and there's uncertainty about whether we can fulfill any supply commitments, that morale is low and several men are considering leaving. She paused. Can you deliver that convincingly? He stared at her. You want me to lie to them. I want you to tell them a story that leads them in the wrong direction at a critical moment. She looked at him steadily. In exchange, you keep your job, you keep your pay, and I don't discuss this conversation with anyone outside of necessity. A beat. Thorne is going to lose this. I intend to make sure of it. I'd rather you be on the side that wins. He touched his hat, set his hand down again. It took him a while to get there, but he got there. All right, he said. All right. She walked away from that conversation with her pulse elevated in a way she hadn't shown him, and her mind already sorting the implications. She had an informant who was now her informant, which meant she could control, to a degree, what Thorne believed was happening at the ranch. That was valuable. That was potentially the difference between arriving at the regional trade convention with the element of surprise or arriving already undermined. The regional trade convention. She'd been building toward it for 3 weeks without saying so explicitly to anyone but Walt. Aldrich Rowe, the supply contractor from Billings, would be there. She'd exchanged 2 letters with him and received responses that were carefully non-committal but not dismissive. The particular language of a professional who was interested but didn't want to show it. She understood that language. Her father had spoken it. The convention was in 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to produce enough consistent, high-quality output to walk into that room with something more than a proposal. She needed to walk in with a record. She went back to the Smokehouse and began reorganizing the production schedule. The 4th week collapsed into the 5th, in the way that weeks did when you were working past dark every day. Not absent of events, but compressed. Each day dense with the particular weight of sustained effort. The second Smokehouse had begun taking shape on the north end of the property, framed out by Daniel and 2 other men, built from a combination of salvaged stone and new brick that arrived from the supplier in Billings on a Tuesday morning that Lenora stood in the yard and watched, like a woman watching a rescue party arrive. The cattle recovered, both of the sick ones, and the 4 others who had shown early symptoms. Collins came out, confirmed the recovery, and gave Lenora a look that communicated several things he didn't say out loud, all of them in the vicinity of, "I understand now why you asked for discretion." Callan had noticed the change in her watchfulness, the way she moved through the property with a different quality of attention, the way she spent time with the books in the evenings that had a particular stillness to it, that wasn't the stillness of learning, but of strategy. He asked her about it one evening, straight out, which she'd expected him to do eventually. "You know more than you're telling me," he said. "Some things, yes." "About Thorne." "About several things." He sat back in his chair. They were at the kitchen table. After supper, the lamps turned low. Outside, the first real snow of the season had arrived. Not violent, just steady, the kind that accumulated without announcement. "Lenora, this is my ranch." "I know. And you're my wife." He said it carefully, like he was testing the weight of it. "Which means I should probably know what you know." She looked at him. He was right. That was the thing about it. He wasn't wrong. She'd been keeping information from him the way she would have kept it to herself if she'd been operating alone. The way her father had kept information to himself until he'd processed it thoroughly. And the result of that particular habit had been a mill that failed partly because he hadn't let anyone else help carry the weight of what was coming. "All right," she said. "Sit forward." She opened the notebook and walked him through it. All of it. Elroy, the salt, the cattle feed, the trip to town, the conversation, what she'd done. She watched his face move through surprise and then anger, and then something complicated when she got to the part about turning Elroy into a double agent, something that wasn't quite skepticism, but had its characteristics. "You didn't fire him," he said when she finished. "No." "You could have." "I could have. And then Thorne would have found a new informant or assumed we'd gone dark on purpose, and adjusted accordingly." She paused. "This way, I control the information he receives. That's worth more than the satisfaction of letting Elroy go." Callan was quiet. She could tell he was working through it. Not performing agreement or disagreement, actually working through it the way a man does, when he respects an argument and is being honest about whether he buys it. "And you trust that Elroy will actually do what you asked?" "I trust that he's more afraid of losing his job and his reputation than he is of disappointing Thorne's man." She closed the notebook. "That's not quite the same as trust, but it's reliable enough. What if he doesn't deliver it convincingly? What if Thorne's man reads through it? Then we lose the advantage of controlling what Thorne knows, and we're in the same position we'd be in if I'd fired Elroy or done nothing." She met his eyes. "It's not a perfect solution. It's the best one available." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, the same slow nod she'd seen from Walt, the nod that meant a decision had been reached. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me? Keep treating Elroy exactly as you have been. Don't signal that anything has changed." She hesitated for a moment, then said the other thing. "And I need you to come with me to the convention in Billings." Something moved in his face. It wasn't quite what she expected, yet not reluctance, but something closer to the expression of a man who has been avoiding a room for a long time and is being asked to walk back into it. I haven't been to the regional convention in 2 years, he said. I know. People there know the state of the ranch, know about the debts. He said it flatly, without drama, but she heard what was underneath it. The accumulated weight of 2 years of watching other men succeed in rooms he no longer felt entitled to enter. It won't be comfortable. No, she agreed. It won't be. She paused. But Aldrich Rowe needs to see this ranch represented by the people who run it, not just the woman who builds things on it. He needs to see that there's a real operation here, a real partnership. She paused again. And frankly, Callan, you know this territory and these men in ways I don't yet. There will be things in that room that you'll read better than I will. He was quiet for a long time. The snow kept falling outside. All right, he said again, and this time it sounded different. Less like agreement and more like a man putting weight back on a leg he'd been favoring. The conversation with Silas happened by accident, which was how the most important conversations usually did. It was late on a Thursday evening, nearly 10 o'clock, and Lenora had gone back to the smokehouse to check the overnight temperature in the firebox, a task she'd delegated but hadn't been able to stop checking herself, which she recognized was a control habit she probably needed to examine. She found Silas there already, doing the same thing, with a lantern and a battered notebook of his own. They both stopped. I had the same thought, he said. Apparently. She came and looked at his temperature reading, then checked her own instrument. They matched. You've been keeping your own logs. Since the 3rd day. He said it without apology. Old habit. My father kept logs. What did your father do? He ran a smokehouse operation in Tennessee, before the war. He said the last 3 words, the way people said things that contained large histories they weren't going to unpack tonight. I learned the trade from him. I've been doing it in pieces here and there ever since. He looked at the firebox. I would have said something about this place earlier, but he stopped. Nobody asked, she said, without accusation. Nobody seemed to want to hear it. He was quiet for a moment. When I saw your schedule on the barn door that first morning, the work assignments, he paused. I thought, maybe this one is different. I'm not always right, she told him. I want you to know that. I make decisions with the best information I have, and sometimes the information is wrong, or I read it wrong. I know, he said. So did my father. He almost smiled. She could see the possibility of it in the lines of his face. Didn't stop him from building something worth remembering. She looked at him for a moment. I want to expand the curing operation, she said. When we have the second smokehouse running, I want to bring in venison in addition to beef. Larger variety, larger volume, stronger position with buyers. She paused. I'm going to need someone to manage the smokehouse operations day to day when I'm focused on the business side. Someone who understands the craft. He looked at her steadily. You're asking me. I'm telling you I think you're the right person and asking if you want it. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the snow was still coming down. The fire in the firebox ticked and settled. Yes, he said. I want it. Then it's yours. She made a note in her book. We'll work out the details tomorrow. Get some sleep, Silas. She walked back to the house through the snow, her lantern making a small, warm circle in the dark. She was tired in the way she'd been tired every evening for a month. A deep physical tired that lived in the shoulders and the lower back and the particular muscles behind the eyes. But it was a tired that had something underneath it, something she'd stopped apologizing for feeling. Something like forward movement. The 5th week brought 2 things. The best production run they'd had so far, and a letter. The production run came first. 3 days of consistent output, properly cured, properly packed, properly logged. Silas managed the process with the quiet authority of someone who had been waiting to do exactly this. The second smokehouse wasn't operational yet, but the framing was nearly complete, and Daniel had the roof going up in sections with a precision that made Lenora understand, watching him work, how he thought, how he solved problems, the particular way a skilled carpenter's mind moved through space. She watched a lot. People told you things they didn't know they were telling you if you watched long enough. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, addressed to Callan, from Thorne's company in Helena. She was there when he opened it. She watched his face as he read it, and what she saw was the face of a man who has been expecting bad news for so long that receiving it feels almost like relief. "He's purchased the banknote," Callan said. She'd been bracing for this. The moment Elroy had confirmed that he'd told Thorne the Smokehouse was struggling, she'd known there was a possibility Thorne might accelerate rather than wait, that a man like Thorne, impatient and confident in his own structural advantage, might decide to move on the debt rather than wait for natural failure. She'd assessed the probability as moderate. She'd been hoping for low. "How much is outstanding?" she said. $1,800, payment due on the original schedule, 1st of next month. 3 weeks. She did the arithmetic. "What's the right of first acquisition price if we default?" "Based on the current assessed value," he set the letter down. "About $1,200. Maybe $1,150. $600 below what they actually owed. If Thorne forced a default and exercised his acquisition right, he'd get the property for a price that would make everything they'd built essentially a gift to him. The smokehouse operations, the supply potential, the land, the cattle, all of it, at a foreclosure price." She picked up the letter and read it herself. It was written in the careful, formal language of legal notification, which meant someone with legal training had composed it, which meant Thorne had resources behind him that went beyond just money. "He's telling us early," she said. "What?" "He didn't have to send this. The original note's terms would have covered the notification requirements. He's sending this early because he wants us to know." She set the letter down. "He's rattling the fence." Callan looked at her. "Why would he rattle the fence?" "Because someone told him things were going badly here, and he believed it. But now he wants to watch our reaction to this letter and see if we fold." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about Elroy, about the information she'd fed through him, about Thorne somewhere in Helena reading a report about a struggling smokehouse and a demoralized ranch, and deciding this was the moment to press. "He's not certain. If he were certain we were failing, he'd just wait. He's sending this because he wants us to panic and make a mistake." Callan stared at the letter. "And what do we do instead?" She picked up her pen. "We write back. Professional language. Acknowledge receipt of the notification, confirm awareness of payment terms, express confidence in our ability to meet the obligation." She looked at him. "We give him nothing to read? No panic, no desperation, no request for extension, just calm." "We're not calm," he said. "No," she said. "But he doesn't know that." She wrote the letter herself that evening, read it back twice, changed 2 words, sealed it. "Have someone take this into town first thing tomorrow," she told Callan, "before he can interpret our silence as distress." He took the letter and looked at the seal. "Lenora." He said her name with a kind of weight she was learning to recognize, the weight of a man who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. "When I placed that advertisement, when I wrote those 11 words," he paused, "I was thinking about getting a capable woman who could keep a house and maybe help with the books. I wasn't thinking—" He stopped again. "I know," she said. "I'm not complaining about it," he said quickly. "I know that too." She looked at him. "Callan, what are you trying to say?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm trying to say that I'm glad you came, not just for—" He gestured vaguely at the ranch, the smokehouse, the notebooks, the whole apparatus of what she'd built. For the rest of it, too. It was an imperfect thing to say. It was also entirely sincere, which was rarer and more valuable than eloquence. She felt something warm move through her that she didn't try to name or analyze. "Get some sleep," she said. "Convention is in 4 weeks, and we have a great deal of work to do." He almost smiled. He was getting better at almost smiling. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and took the letter to the kitchen counter for morning. She sat alone at the desk for a while after he went to bed. The snow outside had stopped. Through the window she could see the smokehouse, both of them, the original and the new frame of the second, standing dark against the white ground. And above the original she could see the faint residual heat shimmer where the oven coals had been banked for the night. She opened her father's ledger. She didn't read anything specific, just turned to the page with his handwriting and let it be present. 4 weeks to the convention, 3 weeks to the payment deadline, $1,800 they didn't have yet, a supply contract they needed to close, and a man in Helena who had structured everything specifically to make sure they failed. She looked at what she'd built. She thought about what her father had written. A patient man can walk into a burning building and walk out carrying everything worth saving. The building wasn't on fire yet. She intended to keep it that way. She closed the ledger, extinguished the lamp, and went to bed. Tomorrow, the second smokehouse would get its roof. Tomorrow, Silas would begin training 2 new men on curing technique. Tomorrow, she would begin composing in careful detail the production record she intended to lay in front of Aldrich Rowe in Billings. Every batch, every yield, every quality marker, every delivery date, everything documented and verifiable and impossible to dismiss. Tomorrow, she would also have a conversation with Elroy Bunch about what precisely she wanted Thorne to believe about the state of the Mercer Ranch in the 4 weeks leading up to the convention. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind, which had come back up and was pushing at the windows with a steady, testing pressure. She let it test. She was still here. The second smokehouse went operational on a Monday, 11 days before the convention in Billings, and the moment Silas lit the first fire in the new firebox and the smoke began rising from the second chimney stack, Lenora stood in the yard between the 2 structures and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something that felt dangerously close to satisfaction before she went back inside to work on the production records. She couldn't afford satisfaction yet. Satisfaction was for after. The records were meticulous because they had to be. Aldrich Rowe was not, from everything she'd been able to learn about him through careful conversation with Garrett at the general store and 2 further letters that had edged slightly closer to direct, a man who made decisions on charm or promises. He was a buyer who had been in the territory supply business for 16 years and had, according to Garrett, who seemed to know everyone's business with the enthusiasm of a man who considered it a civic duty, turned down better-looking proposals than hers on the grounds that the operations behind them couldn't demonstrate consistency. Consistency. That was the word she kept coming back to. Not volume, not variety, not even quality in isolation. Consistency. The ability to produce the same standard of product week after week regardless of weather, illness, personnel changes, supply disruptions. That was what a long-term supply contract required, and that was what she intended to prove she had. She had 6 weeks of records. She knew that wasn't enough to prove a long-term pattern. 6 weeks was a beginning, and Rowe would know it too. What she needed those 6 weeks to demonstrate was not history, but methodology. Not what they had done, but how they had done it, and why that method was replicable at scale. She was sitting with the records spread across the kitchen table on the Wednesday before the convention, building the presentation in her mind, when Callan came in from the range with mud on his coat and an expression she'd learned to read as the one he wore when something had happened that he hadn't decided how to tell her yet. She looked up. "What?" He closed the door, took off his hat. "One of the feed sheds. The padlock was forced." She was already standing. "When?" "Sometime overnight. Walt found it this morning." He paused. "Nothing taken that we can tell, but the lock was broken clean off and the door was left open." She stood for a moment, letting the information settle. Nothing taken meant it wasn't a supply theft, or it wasn't meant to look like one. A forced lock left open was a message. It was someone telling them he could reach inside the operation whenever he chose. "Has anyone else seen it?" she asked. "Walt and Daniel. I asked them to keep it quiet until I'd talk to you." "Good." She picked up her coat from the chair. "I want to look at it." The feed shed was on the north side of the barn, small and functional, with a dirt floor and shelving along 3 walls. The broken padlock was on the ground where it had fallen. She crouched and examined it. A clean break. Something heavy and precise. Not someone fumbling in the dark, but someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She looked at the door frame. No additional damage, no marks on the shelving. The feed stores were untouched. She stood up and looked at the open door. "He's escalating," she said. Callan was behind her. "Thorne. Or someone working for him. He got our letter. Calm, professional, gave him nothing to work with. And it worried him. He expected panic and didn't get it. So now he's trying to create it." She turned around. "We need to put a night watch on the property. 2 men, rotating, starting tonight. I don't want anyone assigned to it who knew about the original salt issue. Fresh eyes." "That rules out Walt. Walt is too valuable in the daytime right now. Put Tomas on the first rotation. He's sharp, and he doesn't spook easily." She paused. "And Callan. Don't tell the men why we're doing the watch. Tell them it's standard precaution before a long trip to the convention. True enough. He looked at her. You're still going. We're still going, she corrected. Yes. Even with this happening, especially with this happening. She stepped out of the feed shed into the cold morning air. If we don't make that convention, we lose the chance with Roe. If we lose the chance with Roe, we have no path to generating the revenue we need before the payment deadline. If we miss the payment, she didn't need to finish. He knew the shape of that particular cliff. Thorne wants us to stay home and tend our wounds, so we go. She went back to her records. The conversation with Elroy that week was brief and specific. She found him at the woodshed, their accidental standing meeting point now, on Thursday afternoon, and gave him the new narrative with precise language. The Smokehouse operations were improved, but production was inconsistent. The trip to the convention was a desperation move, not a position of strength. The Mercers were struggling to hold things together, and the ranch hands were losing faith. She delivered each detail with the specificity of something designed to be remembered and repeated. Elroy listened. His hat hand moved twice. He nodded. "And you're sure this works?" he asked. He'd asked some variation of this question every conversation, and she didn't hold it against him. A man operating in two directions at once had legitimate reason to want reassurance. "I'm sure that Thorne making decisions based on wrong information is better for us than Thorne making decisions based on correct information," she said. "That's all the certainty I can offer." He nodded again, went back to the woodpile. She was almost to the barn when he called after her. "Mrs. Mercer." She turned. He was holding a split log, not looking at her directly. "I know it doesn't change anything, what I did before." He paused. "But I want you to know that I'm—" He stopped. Started again. "I should have told Thorne's man to go to hell when he found me in Billings." She looked at him for a moment. "Probably," she said. "But you didn't, and here we are. And what you do now matters more than what you did then." She paused. "So do it right, Elroy." She left him there and went to finish the production records. The morning they left for Billings was gray and raw, the kind of Montana morning that felt like a threat delivered in weather. Snow was coming. Not yet, but building somewhere to the northwest, the sky, the particular bruised color that old ranch hands could read, the way other men read newspapers. Tomas had identified it the night before and told Lenora they had maybe 2 days before it hit. 2 days! The convention ran 3 days. They needed 1 full day, and they needed it to be the right one. Callan drove. Lenora sat beside him on the wagon bench with the production records in a document folder on her lap and her father's ledger in her bag, which she'd brought not for any practical reason she could articulate, but because it felt wrong to leave it. Walt stayed behind to run the ranch, with authority she'd written out formally in a letter that also named Silas as his second on Smokehouse operations. She'd gone through the instructions with both men twice. "You're going through it a third time in your head right now," Callan said, about an hour out of Garnet Creek. She was. "There are things I didn't cover." "You covered them. I was there both times you went through them." "I didn't cover what to do if the feed delivery from Billings doesn't arrive before we get back." "Walt's been managing feed deliveries since before I owned this ranch," Callan said. "He knows what to do." She knew that. She also knew that the particular anxiety of leaving a thing you'd built in someone else's hands, even capable hands, was not entirely rational and also not entirely ignorable. "I know," she said. "Lenora." She looked at him. "We're going to be all right," he said. He said it without the performance of a man trying to convince either of them. He said it the way someone says a thing they've decided to believe. She faced forward. The road stretched ahead, frozen and rutted and very long. "Ask me again in 4 days," she said. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. They drove on. Billings was larger than Garnet Creek by a factor that made Garnet Creek feel, in retrospect, like a conversation rather than a town. The Regional Trade Convention occupied the largest building in the Commerce District, a meeting hall that had been expanded twice and was still, this year, crowded past comfortable capacity. They arrived late in the afternoon of the first day and found the hotel Lenora had arranged by letter, a clean but unpretentious place called the Whitmore that smelled of boiled linen and lamp oil. She had 2 hours before the first evening reception, which was where Roe would be, which was why she needed to attend it. She'd brought the one dress she owned that communicated competence without trying to communicate anything else. Dark gray wool, well made, the kind of garment that read as serious without being severe. She'd packed it flat between sheets of brown paper to keep the creases. She put it on in the small hotel room and looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand and thought about her father, who had always told her that how you walked into a room was half the conversation before you'd said a word. She walked into the reception like she was supposed to be there, which was the only way to walk into any room. Callan was beside her. He'd put on a clean jacket and had done something to make his hair cooperate, and the cut on his jaw from weeks ago had healed to a faint line. He looked like a rancher who knew what he was doing, which was what she needed him to look like. She'd told him this that afternoon in the hotel room, plainly, and he'd received it without offense, which she appreciated. "Do you see him?" Callan said quietly, scanning the room. "Not yet." She accepted a glass from a passing tray. Water, not whiskey, she wanted a clear head, and moved them toward the center of the room rather than the edges, where uncertain people gathered and where they would be seen as uncertain. "Give me a moment to read the room." She read it. A crowd of maybe 80 people, ranchers, buyers, suppliers, a handful of bankers who were identifiable by the particular quality of their stillness, the way they watched everything with professional patience. She noted 3 men who were probably also seeking contracts with Roe and who had the specific tension of people managing anxiety under professional surfaces. She noted, across the room, a tall man in a dark suit who was talking to 2 other men with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to work to be believed. He was maybe 55, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had probably been conventionally handsome 30 years ago and had since become something more, authority that looked like it had grown in naturally, like a feature of the landscape. She looked at him for perhaps 3 seconds before she understood who she was looking at. And when she understood, she felt the temperature in her chest drop by several degrees. She touched Callan's arm. "Who is the tall man in the dark suit, the silver hair?" Callan found him. She felt Callan go still. "Thorn," he said. The word came out compressed, like he'd been holding it at the back of his throat. "That's Gideon Thorn." She kept looking at him. He hadn't seen them yet. Or if he had, he was choosing not to show it. "He was going to be here regardless," she said, low enough for only Callan. "Think about it. Roe is here. Of course, Thorn is here. He could interfere with the meeting." "He will try to interfere with the meeting," she said. "That's different from succeeding." She turned away from Thorn and found a different direction to look, because being caught watching him was information she didn't want to give. "Come with me. I think I see Roe." Aldrich Roe was not what she'd built up in her mind from the letters. She'd been expecting something imposing, and instead he was a compact, plainly dressed man of about 60, with a neat gray mustache and the quiet, attentive eyes of someone who listened more than he spoke. He was standing near a window with a glass of something amber, listening to a man talk with the polite patience of someone who was interested in being interested and wasn't. She waited until the man finished his point, not interrupting, because she was not a person who interrupted, even people she didn't respect, and then she stepped into the conversation. "Mr. Roe," she said, "I'm Lenora Mercer. We've been corresponding." He turned to her. His eyes registered something. Not surprise, but the specific interest of a man confirming a hypothesis. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "I recognize the name, yes." He nodded at Callan. "Mr. Mercer." "Mr. Roe?" Callan shook his hand with a steadiness that Lenora registered and appreciated. "I hope we can find time for a proper conversation while we're here," Lenora said. "I have production records I'd like to show you, and I believe what you'll see will warrant your time." "I don't doubt it'll warrant my time," Roe said. "Your letters were thorough. That's rarer than you'd think." He sipped his drink. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. There's a meeting room off the main corridor. Second door on the left. I'll have half an hour." "That's sufficient," she said. They talked for another 10 minutes about nothing consequential. The convention, the weather coming in from the northwest, the state of the cattle markets. Roe was economical with words and seemed to prefer it when others were too. She was. Callan handled the conversation well. He knew the cattle market side of things with the depth that showed naturally, without performance, and she could see Roe filing it away. When they stepped away, she exhaled once, quietly. "Well?" Callan said. "He's going to look at the records," she said. "After that, it's up to the records." They were almost to the edge of the reception when Thorn appeared. He stepped into their path with the practiced naturalness of a man who had done this kind of thing many times. Not aggressive, not overtly hostile, just suddenly present in a way that required acknowledgement. Up close, he was more arresting than across a room, and the easy confidence was more pronounced. He had the particular manner of a man who had spent decades being right about things and had allowed that to shape how he moved through the world. "Callan Mercer," he said, in the tone of a man greeting someone he'd been expecting. His eyes moved to Lenora with the swift assessment of someone who was good at assessment and didn't try to hide it. "And Mrs. Mercer, I've heard about you." "I'd expect so," Lenora said. Something shifted in his face. Not displeasure, more like the recalibration of a man who had expected a different response. "I imagine this is a significant undertaking for you both, making the trip out, given circumstances at the ranch." "We make it a point to attend things that matter," Lenora said. "Convention matters." He looked at her steadily. He was trying to read her and finding less than he wanted. She knew what that felt like to a man like him. He expected to find the shape of a person within the first few sentences, and the absence of that shape was, for him, a minor irritation with edges. "The payment due date is coming quickly," he said, conversational in tone, informational in content. "I hope things are in a better position than I've been hearing." "What have you been hearing?" she asked pleasantly. A pause. He hadn't expected that either. The direct invitation to show his hand. That it's been a difficult season. "Every season is difficult somewhere," she said. "The question is whether you build something strong enough to weather it." She smiled at him, not warmly, just the necessary minimum of social grace. "I'm sure you understand that, Mr. Thorne. Excuse us. We were just heading out." She touched Callan's arm and they moved past Thorne with the steady pace of people who are going somewhere specific and not being detained. They were almost to the door before Callan said, under his breath, "That was very calm." "One of us had to be," she said. "I could see what you wanted to say." "I wanted to say several things. I know." She pushed the door open into the cold corridor. "You can say all of them later, to me, in private. Right now we need to eat something and go over the records one more time before morning." He made a sound of reluctant agreement, and they went to find the hotel dining room. She was awake at 4 in the morning, which wasn't unusual, going through the records by lamplight in the small hotel room while Callan slept. She divided the records into 4 sections: output volume, quality consistency, production method documentation, and cost analysis. She knew which sections Roe would spend the most time on, and in what order. She'd arranged them accordingly. What she couldn't arrange was the fact that the records covered 6 weeks. Not 6 months, not a year. 6 weeks. She'd been thinking about how to address this since the beginning, and she'd arrived at the only honest answer, which was to address it directly rather than hoping Roe didn't notice. He would notice. A man who'd been doing this for 16 years noticed everything. She wrote a cover page for the records at 4 in the morning in a hotel room in Billings while snow began to fall outside the window. And what she wrote was simple. These records represent 6 weeks of operation following reconstruction of a primary production facility and establishment of a secondary. They are presented not as evidence of established history, but as evidence of method, discipline, and trajectory. We ask to be evaluated on what we are building, not only on what we have built. She read it back, changed one word, left the rest. Callan was up by 6:30. He found her already dressed, the records in their folder, coffee cooling on the small table. He looked at the records, then at her. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some." "How much is some?" "Enough." She handed him the coffee. "It's cold. Sorry." He drank it cold without comment. "Are you ready?" "I've been ready for 6 weeks," she said. "The question is whether the records are persuasive enough." "They're honest," he said. "That's not nothing." She picked up the folder. "No," she said. "It isn't." The meeting room off the main corridor was small and utilitarian. A table and 4 chairs and a window that showed the snow coming down in earnest now, the street outside already white. Roe was there when they arrived, which she took as a sign he was taking the meeting seriously. He had a cup of coffee and a notepad and the attentive stillness of someone who had already set aside whatever was coming next to be present for this. She set the records on the table and let him look at them in the order she'd arranged them. She did not talk while he read. Talking over a man reading your records was a failure of confidence, an anxiety that spoke louder than the records themselves. She sat with her hands still and let the work speak first. Callan sat beside her with similar patience, though she could feel the particular tension in him, the way a person holds themselves when they are trying very hard not to show that something matters enormously. Roe read for 7 minutes before he spoke. 6 weeks, he said. Yes. She didn't apologize for it. The cover page explains my thinking there. He went to the cover page, read it, set it down. You rebuilt the smokehouse yourself, with the labor of the ranch hands, my direction, and my father's methodology. Your father. He ran a meatpacking operation in Nebraska for 11 years. I worked alongside him from the time I was 12. She paused. His methods worked. I know why they worked. I can replicate them consistently and train others to do the same. Roe turned to the quality consistency section. He spent more time on it than the others, which confirmed what she'd predicted about his priorities. He studied the batch records, the weight logs, the curing time documentation. The variance in your 3rd week, he said, pointing to a specific entry. The output dropped. Cattle disease affected our stock. 2 animals lost from production rotation, 4 others temporarily compromised. We adjusted the production volume accordingly rather than maintaining output using substandard material. She met his eyes. I chose a smaller honest batch over a larger compromised one. He was quiet for a moment. Most operations would have pushed through. I know. I've seen what that does to a buyer relationship over time. She kept her voice level. I'd rather show you a dip in production with an explanation than show you numbers that look consistent because they're not honest. Another silence. The snow outside was filling in the window frame by degrees. What volume can you commit to by spring? He asked. She had the numbers ready. Not optimistic numbers, not conservative numbers. Numbers built from what the 2 smokehouses could actually produce at current capacity, plus what the second facility would add at full operation, minus a realistic margin for contingency. She stated them clearly, without embellishment. Roe wrote them on his notepad. And you're seeking a long-term agreement, he said. Minimum 18 months with option to extend. I want a relationship, not a transaction. She paused. Which means I'm offering you transparent reporting, consistent quality, and immediate communication if something affects production, not silence until it's too late. He looked at her for a moment in the particular way of a man who is making a decision and knows it. Then he looked at the records again, briefly, the look of a man confirming rather than reconsidering. I'll want to send someone out to inspect the operation before we formalize anything, he said. You're welcome anytime. January, probably, after the new year. We'll be ready. He picked up his pen. I'm prepared to offer a provisional agreement today, contingent on inspection. Minimum quantities as discussed, standard quality terms, payment on delivery. He glanced at her. The provisional nature is about the inspection, not about my confidence in what I'm seeing here. She felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 6 weeks. She didn't show it. That's acceptable, she said. The sound of the door opening made all 3 of them look up. Gideon Thorne walked in like he'd been expected, which he had not been. Behind him was a younger man carrying a leather satchel with the look of someone accustomed to carrying things for more important people. Aldrich. Thorne's voice was warm with the particular warmth of practiced social ease. His eyes moved to Lenora and Callan with a satisfaction that he didn't entirely manage to conceal. I heard you were meeting with the Mercers. I wanted to make sure you had all the relevant information before you committed to anything. Roe set his pen down. He looked at Thorne with the expression of a man who had been in this business a long time and had developed specific feelings about people who walked into his meetings uninvited. This meeting is private, Gideon. Of course. Thorne spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. I'll be brief. The Mercer Ranch has outstanding debt of $1,800 due within the week. I hold that note. He looked at Roe. I'd hate for you to enter a supply agreement with an operation that may not exist in its current form by the time January arrives. The room was very quiet. The snow pressed against the window. Roe looked at Lenora. The look said, your response. She didn't rush it. She picked up the folder, turned to the financial summary she'd prepared. The page she'd included, not expecting to need it here, in this room, in this way, but it prepared because preparation was the only thing that gave you options when things didn't go as expected. She slid it across the table to Roe, not to Thorne. Our current debt position, our production revenue to date, and our projected revenue through contract fulfillment by end of month. She let him read it. We are not in default. We are current on our obligations, and we have a clear path to meeting the upcoming payment. She paused. Mr. Thorne holding our note is accurate. What isn't accurate is the implication that we're unable to meet it. Your production has been inconsistent, Thorne began. Our production in the third week adjusted for a cattle health incident. She addressed this to Roe, not Thorne. As documented in the records you've been reviewing. She looked at Thorne then, directly, with the same pleasant absence of expression she'd used in the reception the evening before. Every variance in our records has a documented explanation, Mr. Thorne. We don't hide our difficulties. We address them. She paused. Is there a specific record you'd like to dispute? Thorne looked at her. She could see him recalibrating again. The same movement she'd detected the evening before, but sharper this time, with an edge of something else behind it. She understood then that he had expected the kind of woman who would become smaller in a room like this, under pressure like this, with a man like him pushing. He had built the entire structure of his plan on that expectation. She wasn't that woman. She'd never been that woman, and she had no intention of learning. The debt remains, he said. It does, she agreed, and it will be paid. She turned back to Roe. Shall we finish our conversation, Mr. Roe? Thorne stood in the doorway for a moment longer. She didn't look at him again. She kept her attention on Roe because Roe was the person in this room who mattered, and Thorne knew it, and she intended to make sure he knew that she knew it. He left. Roe looked at the doorway where Thorne had been. Then he looked at Lenora with something in his expression that was as close to appreciation as a man like him probably allowed himself in a professional context. He picked up his pen. Where were we? He said. It wasn't a question. Lenora put the folder back in order. Beside her she felt Callan exhale, just slightly, just once, and then go still again. Payment terms, she said. On delivery. They finished the meeting in 20 minutes. When they walked out into the corridor, the provisional agreement signed and folded into the document folder with the production records. The snow outside the corridor window was coming down heavily enough to blur the outlines of the buildings across the street. Callan stopped walking. She turned to look at him. He was standing in the middle of the corridor with the expression of a man who has been holding something together with both hands for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. That's it? He said. That's the beginning, she said. He looked at the ceiling, not at anything, just up. Okay, he said, to the ceiling, or to no one, or to something neither of them was going to name. Okay, she gave him the moment. He deserved it. Then she touched his arm, the same way he had touched hers all those weeks ago in the yard outside the smokehouse. Just briefly. Just enough. We need to get back before the snow closes the road, she said. He lowered his head. His eyes were slightly bright, and he was not going to acknowledge that. Yeah, he said. Let's go home. Home. She turned the word over as they walked to the wagon. 4 months ago, she'd stepped off a wagon onto frozen Montana ground with $42 and a dead man's ledger and looked at a stranger's broken ranch and decided, for reasons she still couldn't fully articulate, that it was worth saving. She thought about what waited for them there. The smokehouse running, Silas managing the operation, Walt holding the ranch, the $1,800 they still needed to pull together in 7 days. She thought about the payment, about the road ahead, about Thorne's face when she'd refused to shrink in that meeting room. She thought about all of it. Then she climbed onto the wagon bench and picked up her notebook, because there were still calculations to be done and miles to cover, and she had always done her best thinking on the move. The snow fell. They drove into it. Behind them, Billings went white and quiet under the storm. Ahead of them, somewhere through the white, the ranch was still burning its fires. They saw the smoke from 2 miles out. Not the good kind. Not the hickory and curing meat smoke that had become, over the past weeks, the particular smell of something being built. This was the black, heavy, wrong kind of smoke that sat low against the snow-white sky and told you, before your mind had time to process the details, that something was burning that wasn't supposed to burn. Callan saw it first. She felt him go rigid beside her on the wagon bench, and then he was already pushing the horses harder before either of them spoke. How bad? He said. Not a question. A man talking to himself. Lenora was already looking, trying to read the smoke's position against the landscape she'd memorized in 3 months of living there. Not the main house, she said. Wrong angle. The supply barn, maybe. Or the winter stores, Callan said. He said it the way you say something you've been afraid of for a long time and finally have to name out loud. The winter stores, the cured meat inventory, the feed reserves, the salted provisions they'd been building toward the coldest months, were housed in the large storage structure on the northwest end of the property, the one they'd reinforced in October when the temperature first started dropping seriously. They came around the final bend and saw it. The storage barn was gone, not burning. By the time they arrived, it had already collapsed inward on itself, the walls fallen into the fire's center, the roof gone entirely. What remained was a structure-shaped pile of burning debris with a column of black smoke rising above it into the still winter air. The snow around it had melted in a 20-foot radius and refrozen into a gray, sooty crust. Walt was there. So was Tomas, and Daniel, and most of the ranch hands. A ragged line of men with buckets and blankets, and the particular hollow look of people who had been fighting something they couldn't stop and had finally had to stop fighting it. The smokehouse was intact. Both of them, the original and the new one, far enough from the storage barn that the fire hadn't reached. She registered that first, before anything else. Callan pulled the wagon to a stop and was off the bench before it fully settled. She was right behind him. "Walt." Callan's voice was controlled in the specific way of a man exercising significant effort to keep it that way. Walt turned. His face was gray with ash and exhaustion. The scar through his eyebrow was more visible than usual against the reddened skin below it. "An hour ago," he said. "Maybe an hour and a half. We were at supper. Tomas smelled it first. By the time we got there, the whole north wall was already gone." "The inventory." Walt shook his head. "Not all of it. She could see from his face it wasn't quite all of it, but most." Lenora stood in the snow and looked at the ruins of the building and did the arithmetic she didn't want to do, and arrived at a number that sat in her chest like a stone. Weeks of production, the reserve meat that was supposed to carry them through the contract's first delivery, the feed stores for the cattle through December and into January. "Was anyone hurt?" she asked. No. Tomas was standing behind Walt, his hat in his hands, his young face carrying something between anger and grief. "We all got out fast when Walt called it. That's the most important thing," she said. She meant it, and she also needed everyone standing there to hear her mean it, because the alternative was watching 22 men spiral into the particular despair of people who have worked very hard for something and just watched it burn. She couldn't afford that. None of them could. She turned to Callan. He was staring at the burning debris with a look she recognized. The look from the first day, when she'd arrived and found a man who had almost run out of the thing that makes you keep going. She put her hand on his arm, firmly, not gently. "Callan." She waited until he looked at her. "The smokehouse is standing. The cattle are alive. The contract is signed." She held his eyes. "Everything that burned can be rebuilt. Everything that matters is still here." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the same way she was working through it. Not finding comfort exactly, but finding the next step, which was different from comfort and more useful. "Who did this?" he said. "We don't know that yet." "We know. We know who benefits," she said carefully. "That's not the same as proof." She released his arm and turned back to the men. "I need everyone to stay tonight, even those who are off rotation. Double the watch on the remaining structures, smokehouse, main barn, cattle. Nothing gets left alone." She looked at Tomas specifically. "You found it first. Anything you saw before it was fully lit? Anything at all?" Tomas thought about it with the seriousness of a young man who understood the weight of the question. "There was a smell," he said slowly, "before the smoke. I thought it was the firebox in the new smokehouse running hot, but it was—" He stopped. "It was sharper than that, like pitch, maybe. Or something chemical. Accelerant. Someone had helped it start." She looked at Walt. He'd come to the same conclusion. She could see it. "In the morning," she said quietly, "I want you to go through what's left, carefully. Don't disturb anything more than you have to." He understood. She went inside and sat at the desk and looked at what she had. The provisional agreement with Rowe specified a first delivery in 6 weeks. The inventory that had just burned represented roughly 2/3 of what that first delivery required. What remained in the smokehouse, the product not yet moved to storage, covered the other third, which meant she needed to produce in 6 weeks 2/3 of a contracted order from current output while also rebuilding reserves. It was possible. She was honest with herself about the margin. It was possible with no further disruptions, operating at maximum capacity without a single significant setback between now and the delivery date. That was a narrow margin, and she knew it. She opened her notebook. She began working the numbers. Callan came in an hour later. He sat across from her and watched her write for a moment. "Tell me where we are," he said. She told him. All of it. The numbers, the margin, the conditions required. She didn't soften it. He was her husband and her partner, and he deserved the actual truth, not a managed version of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "It's tight," he said. "Yes." "What do we need?" "Maximum production from both smokehouses starting tomorrow. I'm going to restructure the schedule tonight. Longer runs, adjusted rotation, Silas managing both facilities simultaneously." She paused. "And I need to get word to Rowe. Not to renegotiate, to inform him of the situation and confirm our commitment to the timeline. I will not have him hear about this from someone else first." "You think Thorne will make sure he hears about it?" "I think Thorne burned our storage barn, and I think he believes it's finished us. He'll want Rowe to know about it." She looked at Callan steadily. "So I need Rowe to hear from us first, and I need what he hears to be. We had a setback, we are managing it, we will deliver." Callan looked at the desk. At the notebooks, the production logs, the folder with the signed provisional agreement sitting on top. He looked at all of it for a moment. "I'll draft the letter," he said. "Tonight. You fix the production schedule. I'll handle the letter." She looked at him. He meant it, not as a performance of usefulness, but as a genuine division of labor from someone who had decided, finally and completely, to carry his part of this. She felt something settle between them that had been slightly unsettled since the beginning. Not fixed, just more solid than before. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He pulled a chair up to the other end of the desk and found paper. They worked side by side until past midnight. Outside, she could hear the men on watch making their rounds. The smell of the burning had faded slightly, replaced by the clean, cold smell of new snow that had started falling again sometime after 10. By the time she finished the revised production schedule and he finished the letter, the fire's debris outside had been half covered by fresh white, and the ranch was quiet. The letter went out with a rider the next morning. Rowe's response arrived 3 days later. Brief, direct, in the manner she'd come to understand as his natural register. Aware of difficulties. Hold to timeline, awaiting delivery. 3 sentences. She read them twice and exhaled. The following morning, the sheriff arrived. His name was Alderman, a solid, unhurried man of about 50, who wore his authority quietly and seemed to have concluded sometime in the past decade that he would be more effective at his job if he treated it like a craft rather than a performance. He rode in with the deputy, looked at the debris, walked the perimeter, crouched at several points, and examined the ash and frozen ground with the attention of a man who had investigated fires before. He came to find Lenora afterward. She was at the smokehouse, going over the morning's output with Silas. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "you've got something to tell me, I think." She liked him immediately for that. Not, "Do you have anything to tell me?" The passive invitation that gave people room to decide how much to share. Just the direct statement that he knew she had information and he was there to receive it. She told him everything. Thorne, the claws, Elroy, the salt, the cattle feed, the feed shed lock, the convention. She told him about Elroy's role in her decision to use him as a double agent, which produced the briefest expression of something in Alderman's face. Not disapproval, more the look of a man who appreciates an unconventional solution and is deciding how he feels about it professionally. When she finished, he wrote several things in a small notebook. The informant, Elroy Bunch. "He's still here?" "Yes." "I'll need to talk to him." "He'll cooperate," she said. "He already has, more or less." Alderman looked at the remains of the storage barn. "Thorne has lawyers," he said. "Good ones. Connecting him to this directly is going to take more than what you've described." "I know," She paused. But Elroy was in contact with Thorne's man in town. That man is connectable. And the accelerant that Tomas smelled, if you find traces of it in the debris, that's a pattern alongside the other incidents. He looked at her. You've thought about this. I've had 3 months to think about the kind of man Thorne is and how he operates. She met his eyes. I'm not asking you to arrest him today. I'm asking you to build the case that makes it impossible for him to do this to anyone else. Alderman held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded. Once, the kind of nod that meant he was taking it seriously and not just performing the taking seriously. I'll be back, he said. He left with his deputy. The investigation that followed would take weeks and would not resolve neatly or quickly. Alderman was right about the lawyers, and Thorne's insulation from direct culpability was professionally constructed. But the process had started, and starting was the thing that mattered right now. The 6 weeks that followed were the hardest of Lenora's time on the ranch. Harder than the first week, harder than the cattle disease, harder than the discovery of Elroy's betrayal. Those had been problems with solutions. This was sustained pressure without a clear resolution point. Just the daily requirement to produce, to manage, to hold things together, to keep 22 people working with some kind of belief in what they were doing when the grounds for belief had been partially burned. She didn't always get it right. There was a week in the middle where the second smokehouse ran too cold due to a problem with the new firebox's draft, and they lost 2 days of production, and she handled the news with less equilibrium than she would have liked. She was sharper than she meant to be with Silas, who didn't deserve it and knew it and said nothing, which was worse than if he'd said something. She apologized the next morning, directly, without making it into a longer conversation than it needed to be. I was hard on you yesterday, she said. That wasn't right. Silas looked at her with the particular expression of an older person receiving an apology from someone younger who means it. Noted, he said. The draft problem is fixed. I know, thank you. Get back to work, Mrs. Mercer. She did. There was a night, the 3rd week, when Callan found her sitting at the desk, not writing anything, just sitting, which was unusual enough that he stopped in the doorway. She'd been going through the payment numbers again, the $1,800, the 5 days remaining on the deadline, the revenue they'd need from the row payment to cover it. And the arithmetic had brought her to the edge of something she didn't normally let herself approach. It might not be enough, she said. She didn't look at him. Even with the delivery on time and payment on delivery, it's close enough that one thing going wrong closes the gap. She paused. I need you to know that. I want us to be honest about it. He came into the room and sat in the chair across from her. He didn't try to fix it with optimism, which she appreciated. He sat with the information the way she was sitting with it, looking at the same thing. What happens if we're short? He said. We make up the difference however we can. Sell cattle if we have to. Go to Garrett about credit on the supply account. She paused. I've been thinking about whether to approach the neighboring ranchers, Hollis and the Bauer family. They know what Thorne's been doing in the territory. They might be willing to provide a short-term loan on the basis of, I'm not asking them, Callan said. His voice was flat but not angry. They've got their own problems. Callan, I'm not asking them. He paused. But I'll sell the cattle, as many as we need to sell. He looked at the desk. Those animals can be replaced. The land can't. She looked at him. He'd come a long way from the man she'd arrived to find. Not transformed, nothing so dramatic as that. Just more present, more willing to look at hard things directly instead of through the side of his eye. She wondered sometimes if he knew how much he'd changed, or if it was the kind of thing that only looked like change from the outside. All right, she said. The cattle are the contingency. Let's hope we don't need it. They made the delivery on time, just barely, with the particular grace of things that work out by a margin thin enough to see daylight through. Silas managed the final production push with a focus that bordered on the obsessive, and the men responded to it. Not cheerfully, not without complaint, but with the sustained effort of a group of people who had decided the thing mattered. Daniel rebuilt a damaged rack in the middle of the night when it broke during the last curing run rather than wake anyone to help him, which Lenora only discovered the next morning when she found him asleep in the corner of the smokehouse with sawdust in his hair. She stood there looking at him for a moment and felt something that was too large to name and too simple to complicate. She let him sleep an extra hour. The product went onto the wagon on a Tuesday morning, packed in the insulated crates she'd designed and had built by Havelock, who had become, Through some alchemy of regular payments and professional respect, a reliable collaborator. Callan drove. Lenora sat beside him. Tomas rode alongside on horseback because the road was icy and the load was worth protecting and nobody had argued. Roe met them at the Billings depot. He came himself, which she hadn't expected and which told her something about the kind of professional he was. He didn't send a man, he came, because the product was his concern, and he treated it that way. He opened 3 crates at random and examined the contents with the focused assessment of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. He looked at the 3rd batch for a long time. "This is consistent," he said. "Yes," she said. "Even with the fire." "Even with the fire." He looked at her. Then he went to his man who was standing with a document case and he signed the payment order and handed it to her. $1,840. The 40 was, he said, an adjustment for early delivery. She hadn't known he did that. She had to look away for a moment when she read the number on the order. "January inspection," Rose said, as discussed. "We'll be ready," she said. They went to the bank directly from the depot, still in their traveling coats, Tomas waiting outside with the wagon. The bank manager, a thin, precise man named Whitcomb, who Lenora had spoken to once by letter and twice in person, and who clearly found the entire situation more dramatic than he was comfortable with, processed the payment with the careful speed of someone who wanted the transaction completed before anything else could complicate it. When the receipt was in her hand, she stood in the middle of the bank and read it twice. Debt, satisfied. She handed it to Callan. He read it. He stood there with the receipt in his hand and his jaw working slightly, the way a man's jaw works when he is feeling something he hasn't got words for and knows that words wouldn't be adequate anyway. "Let's go home," she said. He folded the receipt carefully and put it in his coat pocket. They walked out into the cold Billings afternoon together. They drove back through a landscape that looked different somehow. The same road, the same snow-covered hills, the same gray-blue winter sky, but carrying something different inside it, or maybe that was just her, carrying something different inside herself. She had her notebook open out of habit, but she wasn't writing in it. She was looking at the road. "Callan," she said after a while. "Yeah, I want to put both our names on the operation. The Smokehouse business." She paused. "Not just the ranch, the business specifically. Mercer and Mercer, or whatever you think is right. I want it documented properly." He was quiet for a moment. "You built it." "We built it," she said. "You kept 22 men on that property through 2 years of nothing because you couldn't bring yourself to let them go. That's not nothing. That's the foundation I built on." She looked at him. "Equal partners. Documented." He drove for a moment. The horses moved steadily through the snow. "All right," he said, and his voice had something in it that she recognized because she felt the same thing. The particular quality of a person arriving somewhere they didn't know they were heading toward when they started. The ranch was lit up when they arrived. Not because anything dramatic was happening, just because the men were finishing the evening work, and the lamps were on in the barn, and the bunkhouse, and the smoke was rising from both smokehouse chimneys into the dark winter air, and the smell of hickory carried across the yard to meet them before they'd even pulled the wagon to a stop. Walt came out of the barn. He saw their faces, or maybe just Lenora's face, which she wasn't actively managing at that moment, and he stopped walking. "Paid," he said. "Paid," she said. He stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides. The scar through his eyebrow moved as his face changed. Then he turned back toward the barn and said, in a voice loud enough to carry, "Boys." She never knew exactly what he said after that. By the time the men came out, she and Callan were off the wagon, and the information was moving through the group in the way information moved through a group of people who had been waiting for it. Not celebration exactly, not shouting, just a collective exhalation, a dropping of the specific tension that had been held for so long it had become background noise, and now its absence was louder than any sound. Silas found her near the smokehouse afterward, when most of the men had drifted back inside. He was carrying his logbook under his arm. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to understand was his version of warmth. Not demonstrative, not small, just steady. "The January batch is already projected," he said. She almost laughed. She almost did. "Of course it is. I figured." He held out the logbook. She looked at the numbers he'd written out. The January production plan, Rose order, the additional capacity they'd add when the third curing rack was installed in the new smokehouse the following week. "This is good, Silas," she said. "It's manageable," he corrected, with the tone of a man who considers manageable the highest honest praise. She handed the book back and watched him go. Then she stood alone for a moment in the cold yard, between the two smokehouses, looking up